Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Politics in the Pub. My name is Howard Bell. I'll be chairing the evening with you. When the Politics in the Pub committee was putting together its program for this particular session, we decided that it was high time that we returned to Tibet, or more particularly returned to the philosophy of loving kindness that's reflected in everything that comes out of Tibet, through its work, its writing, its art, its music, its creativity. And of course, it's a political topic because of the fact that the creativity that comes out of Tibet is severely oppressed. And as activists from a range of backgrounds, we are strongly supportive of the Tibet movement, the Free Tibet movement, the Tibet with Love movement, and all those aspects, all those dimensions, all those colours of the rainbow that are reflected in the wonderful work of our three guest speakers this evening. Tenpa Dugdak was born in Tibet. He grew up in India, and we're very pleased to say he now lives in Sydney. So it's wonderful to have him in Sydney. With Karen Collier, one of our other speakers this evening, the Tibet Effect movement was started with the intention of creating and documenting the movement and the work and the positive impact of the Tibet movement on humanity at every level. Tenpa returned to his birthplace in Tibet for the first time in 2007 with his family. Now, it's important to acknowledge that he had escaped his birthplace as a baby on his mother's back. Tenpa compiled the return into a book called Our Tibet, which was published in 2008, and there's still copies available around and about, and it's a beautiful read and a beautiful reflection. Karen Collier is the director of Brave Media. She's also a council member of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. Karen has made wonderful contributions to the Tibet movement through media and grassroots campaigns, and continues to do wonderful work to free Tibet. And like Tenpa, her work contributes to loving kindness across the world each and every day. Karen and Tenpa have together done wonderful work to progress the Tibet movement, and it is what it is today because of that formative and ongoing effort and campaign work that they've put into its ongoing life and its ongoing existence. Our other guest speaker this evening is Tsering Gyatso. Tsering is a former political prisoner from Tibet. I will let his unique story speak for itself, as well as provide its own introduction. At this stage, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Tsering, Tenpa and Karen.
Hello everyone. My story is not as interesting as Tsering. Last time I spoke at Politics in the Pub, I think it was a few years ago, and I was thinking, what was the difference besides having a few more grey hairs and probably, usually, Tibetans would brag when they get older and say that, it's a testament of wisdom. But the only difference I noticed myself is I didn't drink alcohol before, but since then that has changed. But I wouldn't tell you all the circumstance leading to that. But it's good to be here tonight. And when I met Tsering for the first time, I reflected where I was when Tsering when he was protesting inside Tibet, all the Tibetans in Australia and across the world were protesting in their own respective place, and I was protesting here. And Tsering, he was one of the main catalysts. If you remember 2008, there was a huge uprising in Tibet, all across the world, I mean all across the Tibet. And this was after many decades. You have some random protests here and there, but 2008 was one of the biggest protests. And most of these protests were led by people like Tsering. You know, at the age of 14, to have that sort of political consciousness, and people like him who were raised under China and they have never seen outside world, they have never communicated with outside world. And here we were protesting, and I remember when the Chinese torch came to Canberra, we went there. I did a peace march protest up to Canberra, and we had, I think, probably there were about 400 or 500 Tibetan and Australian supporters, and we had 10,000 Chinese students, and lots of Tibetans as well as lots of Australian got abused verbally, physically. And for me, reflecting back, it was a good experience, because some of the Australians, for the first time, they felt what it must be like for Tibetans inside Tibet, to have, to be a minority and to be copying those abuse, some verbally, some physically. And they had a bit of understanding and empathy for Tibetans inside Tibet. And that protest in 2008 changed everything. First of all, it changed the mindset of a lot of young Chinese, because when China came and occupied Tibet under the so-called liberating Tibet from few elites, they have fed this propaganda to their people that Tibetans are horrible people. They are uncivilized people. Their culture is not as sophisticated as Chinese culture, and some even went that Tibetans are ugly, basically. And it's a sort of similar language you hear with the indigenous people every now and then. And that sort of mindset changed in 80s, when the Dalai Lama and Tibetans started to get some respect and recognition from the international community. Especially, there were strong interest from the West with the Tibetan Buddhist philosophy of love and compassion. And some of the Chinese people who, after the economy was opened up, you know, they have made all this money in such a short span, and at the end they realized that, you know, that doesn't entirely make them happy. So they were looking for something, and that's where they found Tibetan Buddhism. So they had this superficial fascination with the Tibetan Buddhism. They started to invest in Tibetan monastery. They got some of Tibetan monks as a teacher, and in a way it was a bit superficial sort of interest among the Chinese elites. And a lot of these middle people who had now a bit of money to travel, they went to Tibet. And they had no sense of that cultural respect. And as a tourist, you know, they would show total lack of respect for the local Tibetans. But at the same time, they got to see Tibet, and they had this, again, a sense of this superficial interest with Tibetan culture and Tibetan Buddhism. And that changed again in 2008, when Tibetans all across Tibet, like Tsering, protested. And they started to say, oh, Tibetans are ungrateful people. Look what we have done inside Tibet. We have built a train, even though no Tibetan leader asked to build a train. And look how much money we have invested inside Tibet. And they gave this bizarre statistic to prove their legitimacy of power inside Tibet, and started to feed among young Chinese that now Tibetans are ungrateful people, they don't know. And so the language was sort of very colonialist language, in a sense that, look what we have done for you, and now you're doing this to us. And they have built these ghettos for Tibetan nomads, right? And again, it's without any choice, the Tibetans have to move, selling their herds, yaks and sheep, and some of those Tibetans wasn't trained properly to move in this ghetto type, where Tibetans in the past have roamed freely in the mountains and were able to live in environment, with the environment. And any Tibetans who protested against the illegal and rampant Chinese mining, there's a huge mining going inside Tibet. They're building all these dams inside Tibet. And Tibetans who protested, they said they're being anti-nationalist, that they're separatists, even though obviously it was clearly environmental issue. So they hold this narrative and feed among Chinese people. And now if you meet some of the young Chinese here and ask about Tibet, that's what they're going to say. That we have done massive amount of welfare to the Tibetans, and look what they are. And that's again very similar to the Aboriginals, because this is, again, we always hear, oh, we spend billions of dollars to the Aboriginal, they're lazy people, they don't do anything, and it's exactly the same language that the Chinese use with Tibetans. And the problems are strikingly similar with the Tibetans who are marginalized inside Tibet, and some of the issues that we see in the indigenous community. But still, we retain this hope that one day there would be freedom. And it's a hope based on some of the news that are coming up from inside Tibet. Tibetans inside Tibet have never been more politicized than now in the history of Tibet. That Tibetans inside Tibet know who they are. They have this strong confidence of being as a Tibetan, and they can differentiate with the Chinese. So there is no this mindset of we are worse or we are worse than that of Chinese. And one thing is that Tibetans inside Tibet now don't seem to have any fear against the regime. My father, he spent 13 years inside prison during the Cultural Revolution. And looking at what's happening in Tibet now, he said that one of the big difference between his time and now is that when he was in prison, a lot of Tibetans feared that they would be killed. So there is a sense of fear among those prisoners. And he feels that that fear has gone. inside Tibet. So how do you control people when there is no fear? And this is some of the things we see now from Tibet. You have more than 150 Tibetans who have burned themselves to death, self-immolations. And obviously, to send a strong message that even in death you can't control me. And these have occurred among all sections of society. You know, you have monks, nuns, nomad, students, teenage, some high-ranking Tibetan teachers. And then you have, for the first time, Tibetan artists, just like you mentioned. Tibetan artists challenging straight on to the regime. And in the past, some of the artists have sung songs in a sort of metamorphically way, you know, implied certain things. Now they're saying directly to the Chinese. And obviously they get arrested and tortured, but still that sense of fear has now gone. And for us Tibetans who are living outside Tibet, we are sort of mentally or emotionally or even spiritually constant, you know, sending message back and forth. So what they do inspire us, and some of the Tibetans outside, what we do inspire them. And it's the Tibetan inside Tibet one day will free themselves with or without support from outside world. And hopefully that day would come soon. And hopefully it would be better for the conscience of all the countries around the world who have shamelessly did business, who have said that they support human rights, democracy and freedom, but at the same time they close their eyes and do a business with one of the most horrible regime in the world. A regime that we have never seen it like. That is the Chinese communist government. So we are optimistic and we are very positive that Tibetans one day would be able to return to Tibet, and one day the Dalai Lama would be able to return to Tibet, to its people, and could be a strong message to the rest of the world that that level of commitment for non-violent movement that we have seen inside Tibet. Tibet have waged one of the most consistent non-violent protests, probably maybe not too radical statement to say, but probably in the history of struggle. Even in language, Tibetan all across the world, we have never said violent, even in words. And people who have self-immolated inside Tibet, who could have easily harmed other Chinese, have refused to hurt anyone, but to give up their life in the most horrific way to send a message to inside Tibet and also to the outside Tibet, that when it comes to this struggle, that even in most horrific way, that we will stick to non-violent approach. And that sort of inspiration and that sort of passion and that sort of commitment for Tibet, hopefully that will translate into action, and Tibet will free in itself, so that the China can be a full country that it has to, in terms of to gain a respect from the international community. So that's our hope.